A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Ger Rebbe.
For the 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany, the Olympic Games...
Zugerecht waren Brüder in Amerika. Schon 1000 Shabbos at the Skizar.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be cut loose.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is the Gebru Jewish History Soundbites, and this episode is officially about the age of marriage in Jewish history. It's going to cover a small slice of that. We're not going to obviously, it would be too all-encompassing, it would be too broad of a subject to do everything, so I'm going to just touch on the subject of the age of marriage in Jewish history, and I'm basing it largely on an excellent article written many years ago by Professor Shaul Stempfer, which he later published, also many years ago, in a collection of his articles in a book. Book is entitled Families, Rabbis, and Education, Traditional Jewish Society in 19th Century Eastern Europe, by Professor Shaul Stempfer, published by the Littman Library of Jewish Civilization. It was published a long time ago. Let me see which year it was. 1 second. 2010. So that's 15 years ago. And the articles were published many years before that. So it's quite an old article, but it's excellent. And the book itself is a great read. I'm thinking about doing a bunch of other episodes based on articles in the book. And what got me to this topic was that I've been seeing in the news recently about trying to change or slightly influence the age of marriage in various different Jewish communities in the United States. The age of boys getting married to have it younger, the age of girls getting married to have it older. And, we all know how great social engineering experiments work in history. But I just thought it was a prudent topic to speak about how, some just, it's interesting, things, how these things worked in the past. Now, again, I want to make a disclaimer. This is not all encompassing. I'm not talking about thousands of years of Jewish history in tens, if not more, different countries that Jews lived in every century, what age they got married. Obviously, that's impossible to do. I'm doing something very limited in scope, just by way of example. I can open up with a joke, which may or may not be true. It's said over as a joke, but who knows? Maybe this actually was asked as a halachic question at some point in history. The joke goes that there was a rabbi who was asked if there's a conflict in shul about who gets the aliyah of maftir in shul when there's a bar mitzvah boy and a chassan. And the answer the rabbi gives is whoever's older. Again, I think it's, as far as I know, it's just a joke, but if anyone knows if it's actually a true story, I've seen it in the name of the Satmarav, I've seen it in the name of other people, but I'm pretty sure it's just apocryphal. But that goes into today's topic about premature marriage. There was a point in Jewish history when boys and girls got married extremely young. We also know that there were times in history when people got married very old, specifically in the generation before the war, in the Lithuanian yeshiva orbit. It's well known that many yeshiva students in the Lithuanian-style yeshivas in the generation before the Holocaust, they got married in their at least late 20s, very often even later, into their 30s or 40s. Why did so many of these Altamirs and others marry so late? And was that an official policy? It was like an age of marriage issue. Well, what happened? And the answers probably are several factors, like many things in history. Altamira specifically, but also in other Lithuanian-style yeshivas of that time. The age of marriage was significantly later than it was today. And the reasons vary either because there was simply no one who wanted to marry a yeshiva student, unfortunately, at that time. This is a time of rampant secularization, modernization, influences from the outside world, and even those religious girls who were committed to a traditional religious lifestyle, but definitely not to someone who was a ben yeshiva, a ben Torah, someone who was a yeshiva student, someone who was, even if they were religious, but more with it, more modern, more educated, more cultured, whatever it was. And many of these yeshiva students, there was a stigma attached to it, unfortunately. That was a tragic situation at the time. That was one reason given. Another reason given was that the idea of studying Torah full-time following one's marriage, I wouldn't say was non-existent, but was very, very limited, almost non-existent. It was very specific conditions. Either one of the rare kollels that existed at that time, which is extremely rare and extremely small, or to have a wealthy father-in-law support, which also was quite rare at this time in history. We're talking about the 1920s and 30s. And therefore, the prospects of learning Torah full-time following marriage was very, very limited. One would certainly have to engage in finding a source of livelihood, either some sort of work or business or even something in the rabbinate, but it's still work, So therefore, these yeshiva students pushed off their marriage as long as they could in order to get as many years as possible of full-time Torah study while they're still single. So there's just an example from recent history about how the age of marriage changes, in this instance, to make it much later because of external circumstances. What we're going to focus on, for the most part, is the opposite story, where there was many who made marriage extremely early, premature marriage. In fact, it reminds me when I was in the Mir Yeshiva here in Yerushalayim. So when I was a bacher, one of the meals that I used to have the privilege of eating at was Rabbi Yosef Stern, who was a great tzaddik. He passed away quite a few years ago already, but an amazing person, originally American, and then he settled in Yerushalayim, married a Yerushalmi woman, lived for the rest of his life in Yerushalayim, dressed the Yerushalmi dress, but he was originally from New York. He was a grandson of Rabbi Yaakov Yosef Herman of All for the Boss fame. And I used to eat by his house for Shabbos, and on Friday night he lived in Mea Shearim, right near the Mir Yeshiva, and he had great stories. He was full of history. He was a wonderful person. In any event, so his wife was this real Yerushalmi, and she would occasionally ask me how old I am. And when I was like 20, 21, and I would tell her, 20, 20, 21, 21, or 22, 22, she would be like horrified. Like, what? Azoy alt, like so old and you're still not married. Forget about it. I wasn't even dating. Forget about not married. It didn't even cross my mind to start dating at 20, 21, 22. But she was like horrified. And it reminds me of another story that a friend of mine told me. A friend of mine told me that there was a certain rabbi who, in the context of this podcast, will remain unnamed, who was advising those who sought his advice to get married by the age of 18. Because if one glances at the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, it seems to indicate that the correct age of marriage is 18. And therefore, it's incumbent upon everyone to get married at the age of 18, based on this Mishnah in Pirkei Avos. So my friend was saying that, people who follow the advice of this rabbi all get married at 18, whether the boy or girl is mature enough, whether it's the appropriate age. The Mishnah says 18. So I said, with all due respect, but maybe someone can ask this rabbi if he also recommends that no one study Gemara until the age of 15, because that's literally the line before that in that Mishnah. And does he also recommend that one ceases to study Torah full time at the age of 20 and engage in a profession and get a full-time job? Because that's what it says in the Mishnah, that when they're 20 years old, they should engage in a profession. So does he recommend that also? Because Azoy Shteit in Mishnah, that's what it says in the Mishnah. So needless to say that the conversation didn't go well after that. Now, there's lots been written on the topic of the age of marriage in Jewish history, but I want to focus on the aforementioned article that I said from Professor Shaul Stempfer, which on one hand is a nice summary, and on the other hand is a snapshot of one limited time and place in history. We're talking about a specific geographical location, Eastern Europe, and we're speaking about a specific time in history, the 18th and mostly the first half, maybe even most of the 19th century. And this is very much focusing on social history, the social trends and what was going on at the time in Eastern Europe. And this is a very, very social, in general, this podcast, as one of my pet peeves, I always try to go on the social history side. I'm not always successful. But the standard version of Jewish history is, in general, not only in Jewish history, in general history also, is we focus very often on biographical, on elites, on politics, on ideas, on intellectuals, on philosophies, on systems, and the people, the masses, the Am, are really the engine of history. So the focus on social history is not done enough, and this is a very this is very appropriate. In any event, the article opens up. Stempfer opens up the article with the following generalizing statement, which is not just generalizing, but it's also limiting at the same time. It says as follows: in the 18th and early 19th centuries, many East European Jews married off their children at the age of 13, 12, or even younger. And that's the opening statement. So he's framing the discussion to a specific time and place. As we mentioned, it's the 18th and 19th centuries. It's Eastern Europe. And the thrust of the article is to explain the demographic reality before, after, and during this phenomenon, to clarify the geography where this was in the world and why. And most importantly, and this is the primary argument of the entire article, is to prove that this entire phenomenon of this incredibly young marriage, 13, 12, or even younger, that took place in Eastern Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries, was limited to the numerically small elite of Jewish society, and by no means was it a widespread practice by the masses. He also attempts to explain what led to its rise and fall, which is directly related to it being strictly a custom of the elite. Elite meaning the financial and rabbinical elite, which was the Kahal elite throughout European Jewish history, and there's lots to say about the class system, not in a Marxist way, although there have been Jewish historians who have tried to attribute Marxist class history to Jewish history, but that's not what I mean. But it was a very rigid class system between, in fact, the strata of Jewish society was very often referred to at the time, not just in retrospect, between the Sheine Yidden and the Proste Yidden. The Sheine Yidden was the rabbinical and the financial elite. Literally, it means the pretty Jews, but it means the elite of society, and they controlled the Kahal. They were the leaders of society. And this is throughout Europe, throughout Jewish history in Europe, right? And the Proste Yidden, the simple Jews, were the masses. They were the overwhelming majority of the Jewish community, but they had either zero say or close to zero say in the Kahal, in the Jewish leadership. They were the craftsmen and the laborers and the small merchants and the traveling peddlers. What was the brick and mortar of Jewish society, but on the other hand, they were the silent majority. And I'm talking about overwhelming majority. The elite was very small percentage. I don't know, 5-10% of society. Now, before we get to the 18th and 19th century, just there's a very famous Tosfos, which is one of the most historical Tosfos in Shas, which cites Rabbeinu Tam, and this Tosfos is to be found in Maseches Kiddushin, Daf Mem Aleph, Amud Aleph, as far as I remember. And I should have written if it's Amud Aleph or not, but it's definitely Mem Aleph. And it's one of the most important historical Tosfos in all of Shas. Rabbeinu Tam explains in a rather apologetic fashion why the custom in French Ashkenaz of his day, meaning in the 12th century when Rabbeinu Tam was alive, was to marry off their daughters, specifically their daughters, doesn't say anything about their sons, their daughters at a very young age. And he doesn't say the age, he just says that it's very young. And he attributes it to the bitter challenges of the exile. It's worth recalling that Rabbeinu Tam lived through the Second Crusade, where he was almost killed. He also lived through blood libels and other sufferings of medieval Ashkenaz under the Catholic Church. Either way, Tosfos over there says, Rabbeinu Tam over there says, that as a result of the harsh reality of French Ashkenaz in the 12th century, as soon as someone has some sort of financial assets which can be utilized as a dowry for his daughter, so he immediately marries off his daughter, even if she's an incredibly young age, despite her young age, because the concern is, and this is a very legitimate concern and justified, that if he waits around till his daughter gets a little older, to a more appropriate age for her to get married, the dowry money that he has right now might disappear, because either he's going to have to use it, he might become a refugee, they might be expelled, they might have to bribe the authorities because there's going to be a pogrom or a bloodline. Who knows what can happen? It's a terrible time. So therefore, if you have some money and you can use it for it, obviously you can't. The assumption that Tosfos is working with is that you can't marry off your daughter without a dowry. That's he doesn't even have to say that. So if you have some assets that you can use for a dowry, then you use it right away and you don't really worry about how old the girl is. So based on that, we can conclude that at least in French Ashkenaz of the 12th century, and at least for female offspring, the custom was to marry them off when they were quite young. No specific age range is provided in this context, and the reason is very pragmatic reasons. In ensuing centuries, it seems that the marriage age rose in Jewish communities across Europe. But obviously, from medieval times, we don't have large data sets. They don't exist, or at least we don't know of them in order for anything conclusive to be drawn. And therefore, the main focus is going back again to the 18th and first half of the 19th century. In Central and Western Europe, before we get to Eastern Europe, in Central and Western Europe, modernization trends gradually set in over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries. And for a variety of reasons, and I think this comes as a surprise to no one, modernization leads to a rise in the age of marriage. That's very natural. It doesn't even need to be explained. In Eastern Europe, where modernization came slightly later, slightly as in like about a century later, so in Eastern Europe, this seems to have been in the 18th and 19th and first half of the 19th centuries. This seems to have been the heyday of the premature marriage saga. Now, what is premature marriage? It's literally that. It's before maturity. Boys before 13 years old, girls before 12, or around the age of 12 or 13, or a bit above. In other words, it's a range of 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 years old. 15 is already old. but really, really young. Parents would literally marry off both their boys and girls while they were still very young children. And this phenomenon peaked in Eastern Europe in the 18th and early 19th centuries, though it seems to have had a rather slow and gradual start, which is understandable because most societal trends have slow, gradual starts. But one would expect it to peter off when the trend ends, that it would also have a slow and gradual end, but it didn't. It had a rather abrupt ending in the mid-19th century, which is more curious. So the questions that we're going to ask is, how did it start? Why did it end? And most importantly, how widespread was this practice among Jewish society during this time? Now, most chroniclers and most memoir literature and most historians throughout the years took it for granted that when they studied this phenomenon of premature marriage in Eastern Europe during this time, they stated emphatically and generally that it was widespread among the Jews of Eastern Europe, that all Jews of Eastern Europe engaged in this practice. It was a uniquely Jewish phenomenon, and when we say widespread, the intention is among all strata of Jewish society. It was completely accepted, it was practiced, it was everyone engaged in this practice. The question is that true? So in order to answer that, we have to examine the idea. We could also examine the data. Now, Stempfer brings data in the article. That part of the article I'm deliberately omitting because in a podcast it's a bit boring to go through data. But you can read the article if you want. You can buy the book. You can read the article. So I'm not going to speak so much about the actual quantitative and qualitative data sets that he has. Now, so in order to answer that, I want to go from a different angle, which he explores as well. We have to examine the idea of premature marriage in its social and familial context. If the children are that young, in other words, you're talking about kids who are 10, 11, 12, 13 years old, if they're that young, then they obviously have no say in the marriage. No child that age is deciding on their own, oh, this is who I want to marry. I decided it's the right time for me to get married, and she is the one or he is the one that I want to marry. It's obviously not the case. So who's deciding? It's obviously, and this is apparent from all the sources, it's the parents. The parents who are making this decision, who are initiating it, who are informing the children that they're getting married. It's a fait accompli. This is it. It's the parents of both sides who are lock, stock, and barrel entirely making the decision on their own. They're deciding that the kids should get married, and they're deciding who they're getting married to, and they're deciding when they should get married. In addition, these young kids were not capable of living on their own after the marriage, right? They're kids. So they always, in every single instance of premature marriage, literally without exception, they always moved in, almost always with the girl's parents. There's rare cases where they move in with the boy's parents, but generally with the girl's parents for several years. A child this young also was generally incapable of supporting themselves, although there are stories of them, yes, supporting themselves at a young age. But generally they were not able to on their own either. So the girl's parents not only housed them, but supported the young couple in their home. So they're living off their parents. Now, they can just be a couple, or if they're old enough, they can also start having children already at this age. So this is a significant support that they're being provided with. Now, having said that, we now have a clearer picture of what sort of person would engage in this sort of practice of premature marriage, even before we examine any data. We already have a profile of this type of person who's going to engage in premature marriage. It's number one, two sets of parents who are interested in having the families connected through the marriage of their young children. And number two, the parents of the girl's side can afford to house the young couple in their home for several years while providing full support to this young couple. And number three, the young couple has earned the right to support for several years for some reason, as yet unknown reason. We'll get to the reason soon. In other words, there's something about the young couple that's deserving of this financial support from the girl's parents. Now, having reached that conclusion, again, even prior to examining any quantitative and qualitative data sets, we already know the answer to our question. It's quite obvious and logical. Premature marriage was far from a widespread custom during this time period and in this geographical location. On the contrary, it was a small sliver of the population who engaged in this practice, namely what we said before, the rabbinical and financial elite. The difference between the Sheine Yidden and the Praste Yidden. Now, why did everyone assume that it was everyone in Jewish society, when in reality it was only the Sheine Yidden, it was only the rabbinical and financial elite? Because who leaves a paper trail? Who's described in the history books? Who writes memoirs? Who remains prominent in the collective memory of the kahal and the community? Obviously, only the elite, and that's not unique to Jewish history. That's in every society in history. The elite is overly focused on. In non-Jewish societies, it's the super elite, even royalty and admirals and generals and royal figures and the nobility, right? In the Jewish history, it's going to be super razor sharp focus. The bulk of history material is going to be on the elite of society. In every society, and traditional Eastern European Jewish society was no different in this regard, and perhaps even more accentuated due to the emphasis on scholarship and the way the Kehillah was always controlled by the financial and rabbinical elite, who numerically composed only a small percentage demographically of Jewish society. The masses composed the majority, but they left much fewer written records behind, and hence were ignored by historians in the past for the most part. This goes for many, many topics, by the way, but now we're focusing on this particular story of premature marriage. So the ones who engaged in this practice were the elite. They did it, and we're going to explain why they did it. Now, the masses, the Prostein, the majority of the Jewish population, they simply could not afford to marry off their children at a young age. Why? Because they couldn't afford to host a young couple in their home, nor could they guarantee support for a young couple who weren't working. In addition, the reason, in every known instance of premature marriage, that this support was granted was because, and again, this should surprise no one, is a very obvious reason. It was because the young groom studied Torah for several years following his marriage. And this was an arrangement known as kest, support, supporting a young Torah scholar in Torah study for several years after the marriage. Now, once I brought up the idea of kest, happens to be that this week I bumped into Professor Shaul Stempfer. And I mentioned to him, by the way, I've been working the last few days doing this episode this week based on your article that you wrote so many years ago. Your excellent article, which, so I just thought he would get a kick out of that. So he goes, oh, now that you mention it, I have just published, this is what he tells me, he just published another article about the history of kest, which kind of is a bookend to this old article. So this is a recent publication that he talks about the history of kest, of support of young Torah scholars that the father-in-laws provided, that the couple moved into the house, and the father-in-law supported the young Torah student. And it's a fascinating article. So he shared me that article, and I've incorporated a bit of that article here as well. But that's also worth another podcast someday about kest itself. Kest was a custom exclusive to the elite for obvious reasons. The masses did not engage in kest. What was the obvious reason? Most young men simply were not learned enough to study for several years in the local base medrash. Most boys had a very elementary Jewish education, and they certainly did not go to yeshiva. Yeshiva education was only for the elite. Many even had less than an elementary Jewish education. Many boys were completely illiterate. They left cheder very young and to help support the family. Only very few Jews during those centuries, and those very few always came from the financial and rabbinical elite, studied in yeshiva, and were scholarly enough and financially supported enough to continue to engage in full-time Torah study, to develop into Torah scholars. In addition, in order to engage in several years of Torah study, one needed to be financially supported. More often than not, that support was provided by a father-in-law in the form of kest. Not always. Sometimes the Kehillah supported a group of boys in the community, and then you can occasionally have someone not from the elite being supported. But more often than not, it was the father-in-law who supported the kest. Again, only a man of financial means could afford this sort of financial commitment. So we're talking about the financial elite of the community together with the rabbinical elite of the community, which always went hand in hand in the Kahal for centuries and centuries in Europe at that time. Now, obviously, if presumably the boy with his socioeconomic background could study Torah without getting married as well, right? So what's the point of this premature marriage? Meaning we understand why the masses did not engage in this practice of premature marriage. But we still don't understand what was the incentive of the elite, yes, to engage in this practice. Because if you want to support a promising young Torah scholar, then you could do it without him getting married. He doesn't actually have to get married. Well, he could be supported even if not. If he belongs to the elite, then he's surrounded by people of means who would be more than happy to support him, right? So what was the benefit for the premature marriage? Now, as we already mentioned, the 11 or 12-year-olds who were getting married, this couple had no say in this operation, obviously. It was exclusively the domain of the parents. If so, then it must have been beneficial from the parents' point of view. So that's where we have to examine it from. So let's step into the shoes of the prospective father-in-law, who's the one who's providing the support. The younger he marries off his daughter, the quicker he enters into a very exclusive arena, this elite status in the community. It's like a symbol. It's projecting to who he is. It's like today, if you're in Lakewood and you have a private jet or something, or even if you don't have one, but that's how you fly to Florida, or if you expensive vacation, or some sort of status symbol, right? It's a symbol of consumption. It's a symbol of the elite. And most importantly, it's a religious symbol. It's a symbol of that I love supporting Torah. And in the traditional community of Eastern Europe, that was a value that one looked up to, and it made someone important in the community. You are a supporter of Torah. That's very impressive. You are valuable. You are a very important individual in the community. So it wasn't just this financial thing, a financial elite and exclusive status. Like I'm saying, it was both. It was the two parts together. It was the fact that he was a Torah supporter, which in a traditional, very religious society was a value that everyone looked up to. Again, this is pre-modernization, pre-secularization. And you are a supporter of Torah, then you are an elite member of the community. You're an important member of the community. And you're financially successful because you could afford to, right? So this was... this son-in-law that you had was a visible manifestation of this. Your son-in-law in the local Beis Medrash was seen by all when they came for Shacharis or when they came for Mincha and Ma'ariv. He was around. This boy was in the local Beis Medrash studying Torah. This signaled several things to the onlookers from the community or visitors from outside from the community. It signaled that he was wealthy, and he could therefore support his son-in-law in his home at his own expense. It signaled that he supported Torah study, and it also signaled that he was a member of the exclusive financial rabbinical elite. He belonged to this clique of individuals who engaged in such practices, and that's the part of society that he hung with. He wasn't a member of the Prasta Eden, he was a member of the Shena Eden, right? So that is why this practice rose. So So how did everyone else marry off their kids? So the elite, they have this premature marriage. What did the masses do? If they did not have premature marriage, so how did they marry off their children? So firstly, they got married later. They got married at significantly older ages. So the whole idea of premature marriage was only the elites. That means everyone else got married at older. What does older mean? I don't know, it could be 16, 17. It could be 20, 21, 22. There's a range, right? But older. Old enough that they can be, of their own mind. Now, secondly, the masses, when they got married, they were not supported by their in-laws, and they did not move into their in-laws' home, and they did not engage in full-time Torah study following their marriage, and they were not dependent on financial support from their in-laws. In general, most of the masses, when their children got married, these children at this older age already had professions or careers, whatever you can call it at the time. They were, merchants, peddlers, craftsmen. They already were engaged in this while still single in their teens. So they were generally financially independent by the time they got married. As such, the parents had much less input in their decision due to their age and financial status. So the children themselves were involved in marrying their chosen spouse, or at least they had a say, right? In today's language, I don't know if we can dump this type of language on the 18th and 19th century. In today's 21st century, we would say marrying for love or mutual attraction, a modern term. I don't know if that exactly fits the Jewish society of the 18th and 19th century, but that's what we would call it. In other words, the parents obviously had a say as well, but the children who were both older and financially independent definitely had more of a say of who they were going to marry at this time. Now, this brings us to another overlooked point of Jewish history, the shadchan. We generally think of the matchmaker, the shadchan, as a very, maybe influenced by Shalom Aleichem and the story of Tevye, but we generally have this image of the shadchan being a very important part of the social life and economic life of the shtetl. And he made all the shidduchim in the shtetl. In reality, the shadchan was paid as a percentage of the dowry. In other words, whatever the dowry was, he got a percentage of that. So if there was a small dowry or no dowry, it was not financially worth it for a shadchan to facilitate the shidduch, and they never took such cases. In other words, for the masses, the prosti and the masses, the overwhelming majority of the shtetl never engaged a shadchan ever. An overwhelming majority of shidduchim made. Why? Because the shadchan would never look at them. The way he was paid was by a percentage of the dowry, and most of the masses either had small dowries or none at all. And it was definitely not worth it for the shadchan to get involved. So the only ones who, again, there are rare exceptions, right? I'm sure there were times that some poor guy from the masses saved up for a big dowry and it was worth it for a shadchan to get involved. There's probably stories like that. Or a tzaddik who was a shadchan who did it for a little money, or some, I don't know, there are probably exceptions. But in general, the only ones who engaged the services of the shadchan was the very same financial rabbinical elite that we've been talking about, because they could afford to, and it was worth it for them. And two logical contexts stand in the background of this. Number one, this elite was small in number. The shadchan was able to find a similar member of the elite from another town and make the shidduch, right? The elite needed the shadchan because they were small in number. They all knew each other in that town. So generally they would have to find someone from another town. Who's going to know people in another town? Who's going to schlep to the other town to do the research? So you need a shadchan to do it. For the masses are the majority. So there's a lot of people in the town who are from the masses. So there's enough local potential partners to choose from, and the shadchan wasn't that necessary. Number two, in premature marriage, which was something that only the elite did and not the masses, so the marriage was based on the parents' needs and financial considerations, there was no input from the ones who actually got married. So a shadchan could potentially serve a crucial role in this context, especially given the fact that the children, who were extremely young as noted, had no factor in the making of the shidduch. In contrast, the masses, whose children married at a significantly older age, the children themselves were very involved in the shidduch process, and it was much more largely based on mutual values, personal connection, and therefore there's less of a role for a shadchan to play in such a social framework. Based on this divide between the elite and the masses regarding the premature marriages, the very young marriages of the 18th and first half of the 19th centuries in traditional Eastern Europe, we can now conclusively be confident in why the practice rather suddenly came to an end in the mid-19th century. And that's because the premise of this entire social behavior was that the wealthy elite wanted to show their status and wanted to show that they supported Torah study, the traditional value of Torah study. By mid to late 19th century, due to the rapid modernization within Jewish Eastern Europe, which we've talked about on this podcast quite a few times, and especially the fact that modernization started and was most impacted among the financial elite. So they had found better, more modern, and more sophisticated means of flaunting their consumption and flaunting their status and flaunting their wealth than supporting a young couple studying Torah in their home. Right? So they found better ways. I don't know. They moved to St. Petersburg out of the Pale. That means they're wealthy. They were engaged in industry, whatever it was. There was all kinds of ways to, in the late 90s, as one integrated and became more modern, there was other ways of flaunting consumption than supporting a young couple in their home. More importantly, much more importantly, these financial elite, as they modernized and as they integrated into surrounding society and even secularized, then the ideal of financially supporting Torah study disappeared among the financial elite. And especially the age-old model where the wealthy father-in-law always wanted his daughter to marry a Torah scholar, and he wanted a Torah scholar as a son-in-law. This had been practiced by European Jewish society for centuries. And then by the late 19th century, it had almost ceased to exist in Eastern Europe. That's how quick it was. Rich fathers-in-law were not interested in a Torah scholar as a son-in-law, and the daughters were not interested in marrying a yeshiva student. Among the financial elite I'm talking about. The financial elite were also no longer interested in such son-in-law due to changing times and modernity. Now this is further proven by another new trend, and that's the rise of a brand new institution that never existed in Jewish history in this framework in the Jewish world, and that is the kollel. The kollel was basically invented in Kovna in the 1870s, the Kovna kollel, which is another topic worth getting back to one day. Its founding was explained in a very famous pamphlet, Eitz Pri, probably published by the Alter Slobodka. But who wrote, which luminaries wrote in this pamphlet? Many. But Rabbi Yisrael Salanter and the Chavetz Chaim, two of those who wrote, and others there in that pamphlet, which explained it was a fundraising pamphlet. It was basically announcing this new type of institution to the entire, Jewish world of Russia. And the Chavetz Chaim and the Rabbi Yisrael Salanter and others, they explained there that this new institution called the Kovna kollel is necessary for the future of the Jewish people. It's for the future of Russian Jewry to continue to produce young Torah scholars. It's crucial for the future of the rabbinate. Why? Because it was explicitly noted by these Torah luminaries, such as the Chavetz Chaim and others, that since fathers-in-law have ceased to support sons-in-law and Torah study in their homes as in bygone years, it was necessary to invent a new Torah institution funded by the wider community of Russian Jewry, which would serve that purpose. And it's a great story about how that worked out and how the idea spread. But this indicates, again, how the fathers-in-law are no longer financially supporting these types of sons-in-law. And therefore, premature marriage ceased to exist at this time as well. So that's just a little snapshot about one type of age of marriage that I thought was interesting based on this article. And of course, the age of marriage question throughout Jewish history is fascinating. And of course, other countries and other eras have other answers to this question of when Jews got married and at what age. This was Yehuda Geber, Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudageber.com. For questions, comments, sources, tours, trips, sponsorships, and lectures, you can help support the podcast by leaving a rating and review on any podcast platform. You can support the podcast even more by telling your friends and family about the podcast and encouraging them to listen. And you can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on any podcast platform. And I hope you enjoyed.